Many in the Russia-Ukraine war want to continue to focus on what Volodymyr Zelensky says, or what many of the big supporters of the Ukraine side say about how they're succeeding, they can still win. The effects on the ground seem to say otherwise. In fact, they scream the opposite. Just in the last day or so, just actually in the last hours, Russia has announced that they have completely seized all of the Luhansk region. That's now the second full territory, along with Crimea, that Russia has seized. And by the way, there are still currently fighting going on in the Donetsk region, in the Sumy region, Kharkiv region, Zaporizhzhia, and now Dnipro region. So there are lots of Russians around. It's not just the 4 oblasts that we've been talking about from June of last summer. Now then, there are more of these areas at risk. And everywhere there's a Russian boot, it's going to be incredibly difficult to get them to go back. Meaning that because we didn't take any of the diplomatic off-ramps, now there are more Ukraine areas that are under partial Russian control. Some have now been completed. So every day that we delay in seeking a diplomatic or negotiated solution in the most, even in the ugliest terms we can get, Ukraine continues to lose. We talk about that all the time. It's really graphically playing out even as we speak. And to try and to help make sense of a lot of this and to make sense of the unsensible is Patrick Henningsen, host of Sunday Wire, and also Patrick Henningsen, Substack.com. Patrick, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be with you, Danny.
Well, listen, this is some. There's just some. I don't know whether to use the word dystopian or Orwellian, because there's lots of crazy things being said by lots of people. And like we always do, you got to filter whatever's being said by the reality on the ground. And that's where we have some pretty big problems here, or at least as I interpret them. So I'm going to be really eager to get your views on some of this stuff here today. But I guess just first of all, just kind of where are you with your understanding of where things are going? When I just talked about the territory that's physically being taken from Ukraine by Russia, certainly the large casualties that are going in that are concurrent along with the loss of the territory. And do you see this war having any different outcome than the one it has for the last 3.5 years?
Oh, very much so, Danny. You can't downplay the significance of this latest territorial control by the Russian Federation. If you remember back in 2014, Donetsk and Luhansk, which became autonomous oblasts and then declared their independence, the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. This was one of the key objectives for the Russian Federation when the SMO began, was securing these 2 oblasts. And this is one of the toughest fighting has been, the most entrenched, difficult positions. This is where Ukraine and NATO loaded up a lot of their resources because they needed to put pressure on these 2 regions in order to keep the Russian Federation on its back heels. And it's been like that for a very long time. And so now it was also very important politically, the symbolism of Luhansk. This is where the rebellion began after Maidan. So they were the sort of first to really step out. And it was very important for Kiev and Petro Poroshenko, who was the president at the time, to make an example of Luhansk and Donetsk, but especially Luhansk. And so this is where they sent the Pravi sector in. They sent all the really extreme far-right factions of the Ukrainian military constellation. They sent them there, and to intimidate, constant shelling of villages that were on the border of that region, and they would hit them from Kharkiv as well. And so this is, now that these are secure, this is a big political win for Vladimir Putin. Not Donetsk fully, but it looks like it's heading in that direction. But for Moscow, this is major. This is a big morale boost for the Russian Federation, for Russians in general. And so they have a tremendous amount of reserves that they're already trained and ready to go, and they will be deployed to stabilize some of these regions. So you could very well see somewhat of a summer offensive and fall offensive by the Russian Federation in many of these areas that have seemed to have been kind of really slow progress over the last couple of years. And then they have the assets to be able to help to, hold those territories behind them, behind the front line, and to manage them. And so now that domino's fallen. Now Russia, for security reasons, will want to secure Kharkiv. They will want to settle that, and then also to move west. So this is I think a big moment. This is symbolically and morale-wise, it's huge. And as they're wrapping up the SMO, we can talk about that later, transitioning from a special military operation to an anti-terror operation, having these sort of benchmarks along the way is going to be really important for them to build that story.
And let's take a look at that story here, because that's what we see on the ground so far. And I'm actually going to touch on this issue you just raised there about reserves here in a minute. But first, I want to take a look at again. It's hard to reconcile statements with ground truth reality. So Luhansk is now gone, Crimea is gone, and they're full. Donetsk is rapidly falling to the Russian side there. But you'd never know that from listening to the Ukraine leader, because Volodymyr Zelensky is talking like he's from the position of authority.
Вже фактично півроку Путін вкрав у дипломатії. Ще півроку на додачу до всього часу цієї війни. Тиск потрібен. Триває робота щодо нових санкцій. Не змінює своїх планів і не шукає виходу з цієї війни. А навпаки, вони готуються до нових операцій, в тому числі на території європейських країн. У них такий принцип. Росіяни шукають, де вийде.
And by the way, just as a reminder, everybody, if you would please to like and subscribe to our channel here, that would really help us out to spread the news. And we want other people to have the same access that you're having right here, and that really helps us. It's interesting. He's talking about that Russia is wasting another half year on diplomacy. That really stood out to me, because I have to think back and just what you said a second ago kind of caught my attention, because I was thinking back to when you talk about Luhansk and Donetsk, where it started. If there had been any kind of an agreement on the Minsk agreements, or any kind of action to accept them, Luhansk and Donetsk to this day would still even nominally be part of Ukraine and governed from Kiev. And if we had taken the deal that was offered in April 2022, those two would be gone, but then that would be it. And all these other ones that I just told you were fighting were going on would not have even come under fire. All that would have been over. Talk about somebody that rejected diplomacy. Seems kind of odd that he's talking about Putin now, as though Ukraine is in the lead and they're just offering a free hand to Russia. How do you interpret his comments there?
It's more like a scene out of the movie Downfall, towards the latter part of the film, in the bunker. But
right.
But you're right. And it's important to reiterate, Danny, the history. And you just repeated a key point that needs to be said again and again. How did we get here in the first place? Russia's been making that case for years, and the West and Europe just don't want to hear anything. To them, the world, this conflict began on February 25th, 2022, and there's no discussion about anything that preceded that. But more than Maidan, what's important was what happened after Maidan. People talk about NATO expansion. People talk about the coup, the U.S.-backed coup with Victoria Nuland and the U.S. Embassy and Jeffrey Pyatt running point on that operation. They talk about what happened in Maidan, the false flag. Ivan Kashakovsky, the great Ukrainian Canadian scholar, in his recent book and his peer-reviewed publications that show without a shadow of a doubt that there was a false flag in Maidan in February of 2014, and so the whole narrative it falls apart when you see the facts. But more important than all that is the fact that there was an international accord with multiple countries, with 2 NATO members and European countries as guarantors, the Minsk Accords, which was then codified into a UN Security Resolution 2202. And this is a unanimous decision by the UN Security Council. So everybody was supposedly on board with this, and Russia set up the Minsk Contact Group, which was constantly had its door open, its phone lines open the whole time. And in fact, having spoke to them myself when I was in Moscow, they still have their doors open. They still have kept their phone lines open. They've never closed down the Minsk contact group, and they've always kept that dialogue open. And you're so right, Danny. Those would have been, albeit autonomous regions, would have stayed within the Ukrainian fold. So, I mean, but Luhansk is so significant because what Poroshenko did and what the Ukrainians did at the behest of the United States was to enact a policy called lustration. That was to basically declare Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea, or these places, as persona non grata, because they didn't accept a new coup government, which was unconstitutional, and the fact that they were discriminating against Russian speakers and the Russian language and so forth. So, this is not a trivial thing. This is huge. And so they cut them out. They deployed the military against their own people. Again, you know, Zelensky says this is Ukrainian territory, but he deploys the military and shells what he claims is his own people. You can't have it both ways, and that's the problem with Zelensky, the United States, and the NATO narrative, is they want it both ways. And there's a series of events.
There was overnight some significant attacks into Donetsk area by Ukraine, apparently using cruise missiles, not just drones, which had some pretty significant civilian casualties in some of the areas where, at least as far as I'm aware, there actually aren't any military sites. But of course, that never gets covered in the West, unlike everything that ever happens by the Russian side in the other Ukraine territory. But as you point out, this is Ukrainian territory, and those were at least ostensibly Ukrainian civilians that were being shelled by the Ukrainian military. Unfortunately, that doesn't ever get brought up enough, I don't think.
No. And the other thing that's important is the logistical lines for Russia into Donetsk is very strong, and they have really great infrastructure. They've redone the roads and upgraded all the infrastructure going into Donetsk. So from Rostov and these areas, they're able to supply and service those regions really strongly. Now that Luhansk is secure, they can sort of carry on with that process in Luhansk. So what you have is a completely different level of infrastructure, of roads, of supply lines on those regions. And if you cross into Ukrainian territory, you see the quality drop significantly. So there's already a pronounced difference between what is under Russian control visually and what is under Ukrainian control. And you'll see this going forward with each sort of area, town, city, or region that comes under Russian control over time. And that makes a big difference to the people living there.
Right.
And it strengthens the Russian case to the people.
It does. One of the other things that Zelensky said in that clip we just showed was that he was dogging because he said Russia doesn't even want to end the war. They just want to keep fighting. But if you listen to what Vladimir Putin himself says, you get a different story.
I deeply respect the current American president. As for what he's doing within the country, within the United States, or when it comes to the Middle East and his efforts there to achieve peace, for example, in the Ukraine crisis, we value that a lot. And let me say that publicly again, like I've said before, President Trump, I believe, sincerely wants to achieve peace in Ukraine. Just recently, he said it's more difficult than he had believed before. Well, that's true, and it's to be expected, because it's one thing when you look at something from the outside and it's something different when you actually deal with it. And the same goes for the Middle Eastern matter. But it's difficult there as well, because real life is always difficult. It's more difficult than what you initially believe. But personally, I'm always open to any contacts, to any meetings. And I know that President Trump has said on multiple occasions that we could meet. But I personally think this is something you need to prepare for, because as a result of such a meeting, we need to achieve some kind of new level of partnership.
And so you see that Putin is saying, yeah, we want to have a dialogue. We want to have an end to this. But if they don't get it, then there's very clearly one alternative that Russia's going to have, and that's going to continue to meet the military means on the ground. I'll talk about that in a second. But first of all, let's just take a look at the two leaders here. You have Zelensky on the one hand, mocking the Russian side and claiming that there's no diplomacy, when that's all Russia has ever tried to do is reach a diplomatic end all the way through this, certainly before and to this current day here. But yet you have Zelensky, on the other hand, acting as though he's in the superior position. But the conflict or the content on the ground is not working in his favor. So one would reasonably ask, and I am of you, if Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and now we have this latest physical loss here, Russia's winning, then why would the guy who's losing mock the guy who's winning but keep fighting?
Ukraine has been losing consistently and steadily for quite some time, over a year, I would say, well over a year and a half, ever since Bakhmut. So what you have is periodically, anytime there's any potential, impasse or any potential pause or chance to negotiate, you have some extravagant, incursion attacks, surprise attack into the Russian region, into Kursk, into Belgorod, some daring, valiant, raid or whatever, Krinky, or all these different operations, or the one just recently, right before the Istanbul talks were supposed to take place, hitting all the Russian long-range nuclear deterrence, and then that blows up in the Western media, and then Zelensky puffs his chest out, goes on a fundraising tour, and it's just they've been repeating, rinse and repeat this cycle over and over again. And so I have to think, for him, this is a good formula, because it's kept him in power when he really should have been out of power a while ago and replaced with somebody else that might be able to bring this thing to some kind of a real negotiated settlement, political settlement. But he'll keep going, and Europe and the West are quite happy to keep him in there. They're really stuck. They're really dug in. So he is the money man. He's the guy that can bring the cash, bring the weapons from the West, and so he's placated the far right in Ukraine. So it's a disaster politically, democratically. Ukraine is a basket case. So this is all you've got. He'll keep going, Danny. He'll keep going as long as they're going to fuel this PR cycle in the West and politically and keep it going. It looks like Trump's keeping it going. If you look at where Trump was in January, end of January, when he came in, and where he is now, look at the actual act. Don't listen to what Trump says. Listen to what he does.
Right, and I'm actually going to get to that in just a second. But I want to stick you talk about diplomatically and politically. I want to look militarily, because you say he can keep going on this for a long time, but there is an end to how far he can go if the military component continues to deteriorate on his side. And there was a really illuminating interview today on Ukrainian media with Julian Rupka, the German guy who's been following this war from the beginning. And puts out a lot of good information, definitely pro-Ukrainian, so there's no question about that. But some of the things that he said during this interview, and then some of the things he admitted, are illuminating for different reasons, because he does seem to have a limit to how far he can go. He's not a cheerleader, and he does seem to come back to the reality on the ground, but he's trying to put a good spin on things, but it's just not working. I want to show you a few clips. First of all, he's talking about that he was asked that there was information, not just in the Sumy area, but that Russian military itself was growing by the end of this year by an additional 12 to 15 combat divisions.
According to the president, Russia plans to increase its army by 12 to 15 divisions in 2025. Could these troops increase suggest a long-term plan for renewed offensives in the north, or is it more about deterrence and psychological pressure on Ukrainians? Is there a realistic military scenario under which Russia could attempt a renewed offensive towards Kyiv in 2025?
I think it's a very, very complex question because there are so many aspects to it. First of all, it's correct that the Russians are planning to increase their army by numerous divisions in this year, not only in Belarus, but also in the Baltic space, also in the Finnish space, so close to Finland. And the only one stopping them so far is Ukraine, because Ukraine is the one killing and wounding so many Russian soldiers that they cannot fulfill their aims so far.
So he's trying to like say, yeah, look, of course they're going to have 12 to 15 divisions, and a division is somewhere between 10 to 15,000 troops, depending on how the division has grown. So if you're talking about adding formations of that size, that is an enormous amount of combat power to be adding onto the roughly 650, 700,000 inside Ukraine right now of the Russian troops. And he just kind of like, well, but then again, Russia hasn't succeeded. But he still talks about that. Now, as you see Gary showing there, there's a separate, not separate from that, there's also this claim that there is 50,000 troops massing around Sumy. I mentioned that was one of the other areas where the fighting's going on. And I want to show you what he had to say about that. Not that one right now, Gary. I want to go next to the second Julian Rupka comment because he talks about this claim right here.
What is the likelihood of a full-scale Russian offensive towards Sumy? Your thoughts?
Well, I think I'm less pessimistic than my colleagues there from Great Britain. I think what we have seen over the past week, I would say, is a slowdown in the Russian offensive. And we also have heard from Mr. Zelensky that there are no more advances. We even have heard that there is a little counter move. I think 2 villages, Andriivka and Oleksivka, is where the Ukrainian army is right now concentrating. To be frank, I don't see a breakthrough there. And I also, to be very frank, I don't see 50,000 Russian soldiers there. Because so far the Russians, I think, took 12 villages altogether in the Sumy region, in this area, maybe 13 villages maximum. And from what I'm seeing is, and this is also what the Ukrainian intelligence is publicly confirming, they're not using many tanks. They are not using the Air Force in the way they do it in other areas, but mainly infantry. And so far, I think the Ukrainian army has been quite successfully after first being pulled back or pushed back a little bit. As you said, it's 12 miles. I think that's 18 kilometers, but that's the situation we have there for, I think, almost a month.
I want to point out a couple of things from that. First of all, you heard Julian Rupka say, I don't actually see 50,000 troops there. That's actually ironically confirmed by one of our viewers here, who says his contacts up in Russia say that they don't see that. So first of all, it's a question of, is there even one? But what I guess I want you to talk about is that whatever is happening in Sumy, there's clearly a Russian penetration. There's lots of fighting going on a daily basis. But by taking some solace in that it has slowed down for now, that always strikes me as where are you going with this? Because I just told you the Russians are going to add another 12 to 15 divisions on top of whatever's there now, however many are or aren't in the Sumy area. And if you've slowed them down, what is that going to do for you? Because you're not even talking about reversing course. So what do you take about the optimism he has from the Sumy area?
Well, like so many of these reporters on the NATO side, he is speaking some facts. He is saying some things that are true, but the context in which he's saying them is completely transformed to create a sort of alternative reality. For instance, he said that there's no Russian tanks. We don't see any Russian tanks, and he's translated that as, Russia's weak. It doesn't have the resources or whatever. And we know that Russia has basically abandoned a heavy use of tanks in a lot of areas because of drone warfare. So that's where they're putting all their, and these are and light infantry and moving quick and counter drone warfare as well. This is the battlefield on both sides, on both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. And so, but this idea that they're not making progress, this is the trope that is endless. It will never stop in the West. Russia, with all of this and that and all these men and this, they just haven't made any progress. Look how the Ukrainians have held them back. And clearly, the reason Russia's progress is so slow is because Russia is so meticulous about avoiding civilian casualties. It's not in their interest to have any Ukrainian civilian casualties. 0 would be their ideal number, but that's not necessarily the case on the Ukrainian side. Certainly not, that's not in the NATO doctrine to avoid civilian casualties. So they can't, because that just basically completely disrupts the Western narrative about what Russia is, why they're doing what they're doing, how they operate, what their doctrines are. It's not consistent with the propaganda in the West. So it completely transforms the analysis and distorts everything coming out of NATO land in terms of press coverage, analysis, and so forth. So they've misdiagnosed, the whole battlefield from the beginning, and they continue on with this sort of same narrative, erroneous assumptions of what Russia's doing and why they're doing it, and they're translating that as Russia's just they just don't have it. They can't. The Ukrainians are really coming back now. They're resurging. Zelensky's got the wind at his back. Look how slow the Russians are. Where are all these men? He is right. They are allocating resources to the Finnish border and to Belarus because these are front lines now with NATO expansion. So this is an imperative for Russian national security, but it doesn't mean that they're giving up on Ukraine or that somehow they don't have a long-range strategy for Ukraine. That's just ridiculous. The West don't have a long-range strategy for Ukraine. Kiev does not have a long-range strategy for Ukraine. Russia does. It's just very deliberate and very incremental.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to the mentality of the difference between the Russian way of thinking and the Western way of thinking, because we are focused on whatever's at the end of my nose today and in the media cycle right now, whereas Russia has clearly from the outset of this been focused on the long term, and they're not as worried about the near term ebbs and flows of certainly of battlefield movements or media, et cetera. And we're going to see how that's going to play out. I wanted to peer in on one comment he made in that where he's trying to, you mentioned it a second ago, he's saying, there's no tanks, there's no all this other kind of stuff, as though that's evidence of something wrong. There's a problem. But then that was earlier in the interview. It's actually up toward the front. This whole interview was, I think, somewhere around 25, 27 minutes, something like that. Buried in the middle of it was, I think, the lead, because in the midst of, even though in the early part he kind of dismisses the issue that there are no tanks, then separately later in the interview he says this that actually admits, it's kind of a big deal.
I think of big concern, because I do not see sufficient Ukrainian efforts to stop the Russians there. Again, the Russians advancing with a lot of drones, with a lot of airstrikes, but without tanks, without APCs, without BTR or BMP, all these vehicles which we have seen in the past and being destroyed in big numbers. I think the Russians there found the weak spot with the Ukrainian defense, and the weak spot, and this was also stated by, as you saw, some former Mariupol defenders just recently, the weak spot is that there are parts of the front line, as he says, where 5 kilometers are guarded by 12 Ukrainian soldiers. And this is a massive problem. This infantry problem at the first line is a massive problem where the Russians, although they are losing killed and wounded 1,000 a day, I think that's still true. They have more personnel, and in the end they have more soldiers, more meat, as some Ukrainians say, to advance and capture village after village. Because even if many of them are getting killed, if you really have only, I wouldn't say 12 defenders on 5 kilometers, but let's say 12 defenders per village every 3 kilometers. This is not enough. This is simply not enough, and Russians are overrunning these villages one by one.
So, I mean, there you have it. He says there's not enough men. It doesn't matter how much money, how many artillery systems, how many long-range men. None of that matters if you don't have the men. And he pointed out that's what's happening here. So where do we go from here?
So he's trying to make you think that they don't have enough men on the Ukrainian front line, but that's not because there's more Ukrainians dying on the battlefield. No, there's more Russians, he said. 1,000 a day Russians are dying, he claims. So he says, so how could it be? You can't have it both ways. You can't say Russia's got 50,000 men forming around Sumy and Ukraine has guarding sections with 12 men, but Russia's losing all the men. It just doesn't make any sense. So he is trapped in his narrative a little bit, but you can read the few facts within his commentary and draw some really important conclusions from there. So, but he wouldn't be allowed to do that interview on Ukrainian media. We wouldn't be allowed to even be in that conversation on the Ukrainian side, if he was saying anything that was too critical or that talked about battlefield casualties. We saw the dead soldier, the casualty exchange between Russia and Ukraine. I think it was like a 45-to-1 ratio. Is what Ukraine only had one Russian for every 45 that Russia was returning to Ukraine. So that was just on that basis. And other reporting we have, this is just no longer credible. This idea that Russia has a million soldiers they've lost, and Ukraine's only lost 40,000, which is what Zelensky's last number was, 43,000. He said in December of 2024. I mean, are they really sticking to this? Apparently, they are.
Yeah, I mean, I laugh at the one hand just because of the absurdity of it, and unfortunately, the bill payer for all of this Orwellian nonsense are the Ukrainian men who get forced into the front, whether they want to fight or not, and that's the worst part here. But let's see where this may be going. You mentioned at the outset of this episode about the Russian reserves, and that's actually what we see here is that this is from the Russian military site today, which I had translated by Google Translate. It says Moscow has gathered large reserves but has not yet sent them to the front. Over the past few years, Russia has sent only a small portion of its forces and means to the war zone in Ukraine. All this time, there was training and accumulation of troops on the territory of Russian Federation, where large reserves are concentrated. This was said by the ex-deputy chief of general staff of Ukraine. I'm sorry, the armed forces of Ukraine, 72-year-old general. So this is what the Ukraine are claiming, that, yeah, Russia has large reserves that they haven't even employed yet. And now then you have the Ukraine side being exposed as can't even manning the lines they have, i.e. they probably don't have any meaningful strategic reserves, whereas the Russians do. So all that tells you is this can only end one way, and that's bad way for the Ukraine side. But here is the weird part. So all of that stuff that we've talked about so far makes it just abundantly clear on the ground there is no rational path to continuing to resist and hope that somehow you can reverse things when there's no means to do so. It's one thing if you have Zelensky and he's deluded from reality and it's his country. He just has lost the ability to see reality, and he can only go in this path because he's painted himself in a corner. But it's a separate thing if it's some in the West. And let me just show you a few examples here. This is from, I think it's today's Foreign Affairs magazine, where the author says that Ukraine can still win. And he writes, this author here, Michael Carpenter, writes that Russia is much weaker economically than many analysts realize, and hard-hitting sanctions and export controls can still cripple its war economy. Ukraine is fighting smartly and could turn the tide on the battlefield with more high-end drones, air defense systems, long-range missiles, and munitions. With a change of strategy, Ukraine can still win the war in the near term if both Europe and the United States decide to give assistance it needs. I went through to read that because the first thing I thought of, well, how can you make that argument when the manpower issue is what Julian Rurka just admitted? We can see it for ourselves, but now it was validated on that. And he just dismisses it. The author just says, well, I know that they don't have a lot of manpower, but by fighting smarter, we can flip it around. And I just got to ask before I even show you some of the other examples that we have here. This is Foreign Affairs magazine, which is supposed to be the cream of the crop of Western intellectual thinking and foreign policy issues here. And then this guy is basically saying, forget everything that exists on the ground, and I don't want it to be this way, so I'm just going to claim that manpower doesn't matter. If this is elite thinking in our country, what does that tell you?
The Foreign Affairs, that's the mouthpiece for the Council on Foreign Relations, basically. But those types of publications are designed to build consensus. These are consensus-building think tanks and publications, and they want to maintain that consensus in the Beltway. But they call it a war, and this is the other thing. They by intentionally misreading the conflict. And this is the same with Gaza and Israel, but the United States especially, and the intelligentsia and all of this, they'll say this is a war. And then when Russia says no, it's a security operation, it's a special military operation. They just laugh and say, "La, they're putting a spin on this undeclared, unprovoked, full-scale war of aggression." And so they're never going to really evaluate what their actions are and what the Russian objectives are. And they don't care. They just dismiss it out of hand. Oh, Russia wants to demilitarize Ukraine. Oh, ha, 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 denazify. There's no Nazis in Ukraine. And they just laugh. And then they want to secure the rights of, the Russian oblasts. And no, Putin is the dictator. It couldn't be Zelensky. He's the paragon of democracy. So you see that propaganda has been laid on so consistently for all these years that these people just basically can't think outside of that box. And so they're going to consistently just continue to get it wrong. And again, Russia has, if you look at the special military operation, they have the balance of resolve because their objectives are very specific. And I don't understand what the Western objective is to defeat Russia. That's not going to happen. The Zelensky objective to defeat Russia, that's not going to happen. But Russia can demilitarize Ukraine. They can probably more difficult to denazify Ukraine. And then the NATO membership, it's off the table. It's off the table. So Russia's already ticked, 2 out of maybe their top 5 objectives. They've already completed. Then with the the annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, and the other oblasts to the Russian Federation, Russia is winning by leaps and bounds. If you take a broader look over the last 8 years, 10, 12 years, there's no doubt Russia is winning. And so they're going to continue to win.
You mentioned that the foreign affairs being the mouthpiece of the Council on Foreign Relations, and they have a definite viewpoint that they like to pursue. But it's one thing if it's a writer, if it's an academic, but it should be another thing if it's actually an active duty general. There was a Senate testimony last week with I think his name is Grinkowicz, who's up for a new position, and he was, I think, for the U.S. European Command, and he was asked in this testimony, is the war basically over? And Gary, if you could put that X post up, because I just want to put on here, he answered the senator and said, "I think Ukraine can win. I think anytime your homeland is threatened, you fight with the tenacity it's difficult for us to conceive of if we haven't found ourselves in the same situation." Listen, let me ask you this question. So I've never heard anyone who's questioned the fighting spirit of the Ukraine side or their determination to win or their incredible spirit to continue going down this path. But it's not enough to want to win. And if you have 3.5 years of evidence that your country is getting dismembered, that your people are dying in massive numbers, that suddenly, if you wanted a little bit more, you're gonna end up reversing the course on the battlefield. How do you see that?
Well, first of all, you can't remove from this story the 8 years between 2014 and 2022, where the militia that was formed from the DPR and the LPR, the Donetsk and Lugansk Republic, they broke the back of the Ukrainian military. They held their lines for 8 years before Russia came in. That was not the Russian army that did that. They did that. They lived there. You can't underestimate their tenacity.
That's a great point.
And the fight that they have. They never get credit. The West has stripped that from the story because it doesn't really fit the narrative. And they're just saying, no, the workaround for the West was, there's little green men running around. We've got some satellite photos of a little green man in Donetsk, and the Russians are there, kind of thing. And they just laugh at you. And it totally discounts the effort and the determination of those people to be independent, to exert their UN Charter rights from Article 1, self-determination. That's they only cite the Ukrainian Article 51, self-defense against the Russian Federation, but they miss the first part of the story, and that is the essential part. That's what led to Minsk. This is why Russia intervened. You strip all of that out, and you can't possibly paint a realistic picture of what you're looking at today, but yet this is what the West and all of these academics, think tankers, pundits on TV, and generals, and the Jack Keanes of the world, for them, the world began on February 25th, 2022. End of story. Don't want to talk about it. They don't even know.
It's interesting you bring up that topic there about stripping out part of the story here. So that was an active duty general who's trying to, I don't know if he's been voted in yet. It probably will be, to be the next U.S. Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, et cetera. But a retired general that we talked about a lot, Ben Hodges, came on recently, and I think this is actually may have been published today. He was voicing a similar thing, and he's dogging in this particular clip here. The precursor to this question is about President Trump, and he's kind of taken President Trump to task for not understanding how things work in Europe, and also not understanding how hard people are fighting.
Him and other people around him don't understand why people fight. I mean, you could say that the colonials didn't have the cards when we rebelled against Great Britain, or you could say that the Taliban did not have the cards when they defeated us in Afghanistan, or the Viet Cong didn't have any cards when they defeated us in Vietnam, and on and on and on and on. Why do people fight? And the Ukrainians are fighting for their survival, and he doesn't get that, and that is compounded with the fact that because he would have never done it himself, by the way. I mean, his own personal avoidance of the draft is pretty well known, but that combined with what you've described so well as this perception, and unfortunately there's a lot of the so-called Russia experts in Washington as well as here in Germany that absolutely believe that, like, come on, there's just no way.
It's just because you set this up so beautifully. He says you don't understand why people fight, ignoring the fact that the people in Luhansk and Donetsk are fighting, and you don't understand why they're fighting. And he also doesn't even consider why the Russians are fighting. So you can't look at one in isolation. You have to look at why all of them are fighting, and there is tremendous reason for the Russians and the people in Donetsk and Luhansk to be fighting too, and you kind of got to take that into consideration. And I want to hear your comments, but let me just point one thing, because I'm sorry, it's a little bit funny, but one of our viewers was as he was making his comments here, and they were wondering why he was so strange. Says he probably wasn't breastfed as a child, so I don't know if that's is here and there, but interesting comment. So thank you, Grassy Knoll. I'm sorry. Please continue.
And also, why you need to know why the Ukrainian soldiers didn't fight in Crimea. Nobody talks about that. So many of them defected immediately when the moment arose in Crimea in the spring of 2014, immediately to the Russian side. Russian-speaking people who were Ukrainians by nationality, but Russian culturally and historically and linguistically. They didn't fight. So Ben Hodges isn't factored that in. That is the whole oblast of Crimea gone, literally in a flash. And there's reasons for that. And the reasons why Ukrainians have to be press ganged off the streets of all of these places in Ukraine because they don't want to fight. They're not dying to go defend the homeland. They've had it. We've spoke to them. You've probably heard from them as well. There's plenty of interviews. There's plenty of data out there to show that the thirst to fight the Russians is waning, if not completely dead at this point. And the only people that are pushing it hard are the people who are benefiting from it financially and politically. And so Ben Hodges he does a lot of the propaganda for British tabloids. You see him a lot in the European and British media, saying some outrageous things over the last 3 years, and he's hardly been right at all, if
right.
ever. But he just kind of carries on because he tells people what they want to hear if they really hope that Ukraine has a chance to somehow snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. He's right there at everyone's beck and call. Especially the British tabloids, So, but it's just not credible. And so this idea that the feisty Ukraine, as you said, Danny, you can't take anything away from Ukrainian soldiers who have fought bravely in what they believe is a righteous effort. But so many, I think more people don't want to be there based on what I've seen, plus the amount of POWs that have spoken afterwards and the ones who have defected in Russia as well, because it's not an ethno state. There are different nationalities: Transcarpathian Hungarians, Russian oblasts, Western Ukraine, identifies Ukrainian, and others. And so it's not a completely homogenous nation state. And that's the whole point. That's why Ukraine has fallen apart, because they had a multi-ethnic, a multilingual federal state, if you will, or country that could have been a federal state, and they decided to start picking and choosing who's going to be treated differently, laws for these people, not for these people.
Mistake.
And every time in history, I don't have to be a PhD in history to know that that's when civil wars begin. And the result of many civil wars in history is the fracturing and the division and breakup of that country. That's just history. We don't, so these people are all in denial of a process that took place from the Maidan in 2014, further before that, of course, but we could just start then, and a whole series of events that have caused the breakup of Ukraine. It's not rocket science. I'm not saying anything that's just completely, outrageous. This is just history. This happens when you have these things unfold.
They do, and I want to circle back to something you said at the early part of this episode here about Trump, because Trump has always been, he campaigned on he was going to end this war in 24 hours, and then that turned into all right, maybe 100 days, and then it was like, all right, well, no, in April we're days away from walking away, and then we walked away from walking away, and then Trump said, no, it's about 2 weeks, and then the 2 weeks passed, and then there's nothing, and this is yesterday. Despite Trump's all these comments about what he wants to do and what his deadlines he set and then passed, Tammy Bruce, the spokeswoman for the State Department, gave a comment yesterday where Trump is now.
The president is the one person who's been able to bring everyone to the table, who's willing to talk to everyone, who has the power of the United States at his back and the support of the American people. And I think that he understands, and he has repeated again within the last few days, just his frustration and lack of acceptance at the attacks that have gone on in Ukraine by Russia, and that it has to stop, that there are too many people dying. This remains a key element for his administration. It is a key part of the work that his administration as a whole is doing, is our support for Ukraine and the need for that carnage to stop.
I mean, he's been saying that since he came in, but as you said, no action has followed. What do you think is going to happen with Trump? I mean, will he just literally just talk this until it comes to a military conclusion sometime later this year, perhaps?
Yeah, I think all day long. Moscow has already read Trump, and they've read Washington. They're going to carry on. They've got plans and objectives. They have things that they want to achieve for their national security, for the stability of these regions. And in the future, there's the security of the Russian Federation going forward for the next 100 years. They're just going to carry on and do what they need to do to nail all that down, while Trump continues to have we've got a deal, we've got a minerals deal, we've got a peace deal, we've got a ceasefire. Every week there's some tweet or announcement. He's got something cooking, but it doesn't actually address the actual problems. But the reason why this fails with Trump is because he's portraying this and his administration that the U.S. is just a benign, neutral actor that's just observing this horrible. So many people are dying. Oh, this is terrible. We really want to bring this to an end because we want to do the right thing, and that's not the case. The U.S. is a co-belligerent. So, and Russia is kind of like playing along with the stick, keeping the negotiations door open, keeping the dialogue going, which is smart by Moscow as well. And it's good that the U.S. is kind of engaging in some level of dialogue, even if it's not that substantial. But for Ukraine, this is a disaster. Yeah. It just continues to get worse and worse. So I think they're just going to get squeezed more and more. And I think at some point something has to break, and it might be Ukraine.
Yeah, that's certainly the leading contender for what's the most likely to happen. But what's nearly impossible to happen is any kind of battlefield reversal here, because the fundamentals just don't exist to support that. Listen, in the last few minutes we have here, I want to shift gears a little bit to another topic I know you cover quite a lot, and that is in the Middle East, and lots going on there. So we don't have time to cover the whole thing, but a couple of key things I do want to get your view on is, first of all, it was announced, I think just this morning, at least that I saw it, that apparently there's a meeting going to take place between Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump here in Washington. And of course, that's coming on the heels of all this, stuff that's been happening with the so-called 12-day war. And we'll see if that actually plans out or if it's just a temporary pause that's happened here. But let me show you this is what Trump said earlier today before we started this show here.
They are so bummed out. Did you see the report issued this morning? The place was decimated. It'll be years before anybody even gets down there. So That's not a priority, but we'll have a report and we'll have whatever we want. We'll get from whatever we want from Iran. And I think, and I hope they will have a good, you know, they have massive sanctions right now, biting sanctions. It's going to be very hard for them to do anything with those sanctions. And I look forward to maybe there'll be a time when we get along with them and they can rebuild their country.
But is there a point where you tell Netanyahu, like, you've got to end this now, you got to strike a deal?
Well, he wants to. I can tell you he wants to, and I think we'll have it. I think we'll have a deal next week.
Thank you.
That's what I think.
I think we'll have a deal. Gary, if you could also play that other one we have of Trump talking about Netanyahu.
Well, he's coming here. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk about the great success we had. I mean, we had an incredible, in Iran, we had an incredible success, like really nobody's had in many, many years. That was a precision war strike, and the word obliteration can now be used because the Atomic Energy Commission said you can't even get into the place. It was demolished. It was really demolished. It was a great, brilliant strike, and how to go forward. We're also going to talk about Gaza. We want to get the rest. We got a lot of hostages back, but we're going to talk about Gaza.
So what do you think about that? I mean, in the scattershot thing, we obliterated the Iranian nuclear facilities. We're going to get a deal on Gaza probably in a week or so. And yeah, we're going to just basically bring peace everywhere. What do you make of that?
Yeah, we've got deals cooking everywhere. You know, he's like a carnival barker at this point. And he's saying, look how bombed out Iran is. Trump actually looked bombed out in those two clips. He looked like he was worse for wear. So he's clearly not getting enough sleep, or he looked really haggard. I'm just making an observation, the physical observation. So this is taking a toll on him as well, as it does many presidents. Most stressful job in the world, U.S. president, for sure. But again, same problem with Ukraine. It's got two realities going. We've got the reality that we all know because we follow the facts and the reports and we triangulate information and data to get a sober and objective, level-headed analysis. Then you've got the reality in Washington, which is totally different based on narratives and propaganda. It's a great success. No one's had a success like this ever. Really, if that's a success for Israel, take a look at Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is going to be going through gentrification pretty soon. They wiped out so many neighborhoods in their capital city that was untouchable a month ago. It was regarded as untouchable under the protection of the Iron Dome, and Iran has just shattered that. Israelis are fleeing or trying to leave the country. Netanyahu is basically having to put orders in to keep people, the flight of the population out of the country. And so I don't call that a success. So for Iran, a success was, and of course, people who were smart knew this, success for Iran was to survive and to demonstrate that they could deal some kind of a blow militarily to Israel and survive a U.S. attack. And they've done that. And it's galvanized support within Iran in ways that has never been imagined before. And they've got everybody in that country behind the leadership, even people that were criticizing or skeptical of the leadership. I've even seen royalists in America that are basically standing behind the Ayatollah because they're standing with the Iranian people against Israeli aggression. So, I mean, so you can thank Donald Trump and Netanyahu for that. And then he's talking about the IAEA. The IAEA, I don't know if Donald Trump got the memo, but they said Iran's going to be up and running in a couple of months with nuclear and the enrichment, enriched uranium.
That part.
They don't know where the enriched uranium is. It's probably left Fordow. So what's Trump talking about? He's, again, trying to make it to spin this narrative. So it's all sales. It's all, a sales pitch to try to create the impression that somehow they're on the right track, that they're making progress, when in fact, it seems to me, and it seems to many people, like the United States and Israel have gotten into a situation where they've come out much worse afterwards than when they went in. And all this talk about ceasefires, again, negotiations, oh, we're going to do a deal here, we're going to do a deal there, that nobody trusts the United States. The Iran's not going to sit down and trust the U.S. ever again. Neither is Russia. They know what they're dealing with. So they might give it lip service and say, okay, yeah, we want to talk. We'd like to do something, but we're cautious. And Trump's trying to sell this like, oh, we can put this together. Gaza, we can put it together in Gaza. No, they're not going to put it together. They're going to make the same mistakes they've done every single time, and they're doing it again with the Abraham Alliance. They're doing a deal in absentia without the Palestinian delegation, which is what they did with the Abraham Accords, which brought you October 7th. And so we could be in the same cycle in the future again.
Well,
So-
yeah, and even aside from the Gaza situation, which is just insanely complicated and very far from any kind of a deal. So when Trump says, "Yeah, we'll have a deal within a week," I mean that's just fantasy. There's not any deal to have there, especially as you point out. If the Palestinians are not part of that conversation, that's clearly not going to happen. But I think it's even less likely to happen because Israel doesn't want it to happen. They want to talk about peace deal, but they don't want to actually do one. And I think that one of the things that I'm concerned about that with Netanyahu coming here is that he's going to talk with Trump. And I think that I believe you are in agreement with this, that this whole ceasefire that Trump said, where it's a quote 12-day war, it's over and that's it, the fighting's done. I think it was just a temporary pause because Israel needed it to be a temporary pause, and then they want to continue to feed the job. That's not the only place that's coming from Netanyahu. It's also coming from many American quarters. I've showed in previous shows here recently that Lindsey Graham is saying that he wants regime change. That's the only thing that could work. And then this morning we had Jack Keane added to the list.
One of the things we absolutely have to conclude here is the Iranians, remember, never were serious about negotiations because they always thought they could survive an airstrike, recover, and rebuild. Regardless of whether we're completely destroyed, severely damaged, or somewhere in between, I am absolutely convinced that the Iranians have not given up the idea of having a nuclear weapon. And why is that? It's because it preserves their regime. It's the number one reason why they have it. The other thing is to use it to destroy Israel. So if that's the case, then they're going to assess, and I think that assessment is going on now. They have to get under the ground to see what truly has happened, and they'll begin to recover, and they will begin to rebuild. And when we see that happening, we should hit them again.
You know, the reason I chose that particular clip there is because I think Keane unintentionally revealed the truth that he actually knows, despite from what he said, because he said the only reason they want to bomb is for regime survival, i.e. deterrence. And there's a lot of logic for that. And then he's like, oh, well, and then, of course, to destroy Israel. Like, those are mutually exclusive. You can't have a bomb for deterrence and security, and you want to get it to destroy Israel, because then that's basically suicide, because you would be obliterated with nuclear weapons more than what you could stop. And they won't do that. And he knows they won't do that. But you see, he's still advocating, let's get ready to hit them again. Ergo, there will be no peace.
Yes, because he can't admit that Iran is a rational actor in the international system. He can't say that they're pragmatic and they will trade blows, but restrain themselves to make sure they're not, going over the top and exposing themselves as the belligerent or as the warring party. And so he can't say that. He can't say that Iran is behaving like India. Iran is behaving like China. Iran is behaving like the Russian Federation. No. It's the crazy mullahs, and they just want to wipe Iran off the map because of something Ahmadinejad said in a speech at Columbia University in 2007. That's basically where they're at. And that's where they've been at Fox for the last 30 or 40 years. They haven't changed their tune much. And Jack, again, tells them what they want to hear. That's why they pay him $500 or $1,000 a pop for a 5-minute segment. I'm not sure what his rate is, but I'm sure it's not cheap, and he's not doing it for altruistic
That's the good news of his heart, yeah.
but the point, the real ruse of all this is this idea that there's a ceasefire cooking, and so you see a pattern. Let's just very quickly, I'll show you. The first, Witkoff, Trump comes in, gets inaugurated. Witkoff is the man. He's the special envoy. He's the wizard. He's the magic man. The magic man goes there, tells Netanyahu off on Shabbat. Boom, ceasefire. Everyone's celebrating. Only Trump could have brought peace to the Middle East. Only Donald could have done it. And of course, then Netanyahu comes at the beginning of February, and they have their face-to-face meeting. And what happens after the face-to-face meeting? No more ceasefire. The war resumes. In fact, it resumes even more violent than before in terms of the amount of bombing they're doing of refugee camps, and they blockade They cut off food, water, and supplies, and continue to block UN aid into. So that's the pattern. And then it happens again. Then Witkoff is deployed, and he's going, we're going to lift the siege. We're going to let food and water in. You just have to release these hostages, these Israeli hostages. And don't worry, Hamas, we're going to, I'll do something for you. You do something for me. And of course, then they release the hostages, and they don't lift the siege. They don't lift the siege. Instead, they send in U.S. mercenaries in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is a total scam. And they're creating feeding points, lining people up, and then shooting at them. And that's been going on for a month. And there's no outrage about this. So what's going to happen now? A rinse and repeat. You're going to see the same. A pause, maybe. He's talking about a 60-day ceasefire. It's ridiculous. He's putting these time limits on these things. Israel has broken every single ceasefire, any single agreement that's ever been reached between these two parties. Israel has violated it because Israel has objectives. They want to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, full stop. It's obvious by now. And they want to make it unlivable. And they have destroyed, hundreds of thousands of homes and killed, by the last report from Harvard Dataverse, 377,000 Palestinians dead or missing in Gaza. This is way beyond 60-odd thousand, the number we were previously working on. And so what's going on here? Is Israel going to suddenly reverse their policy, or are they going to finish the job, which which is being pushed for in the Israeli political circles and rhetoric? They want to finish the job. They've just suspended Netanyahu's corruption trial. Trump even weighed in to tell the judiciary to back off Netanyahu because he's done so much for Israel.
Yeah.
They're going to suspend his trial because, again, they want him to finish the job. They want him to cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. I don't see any indication that this policy is going to be stopped or reversed. So all of this is talk. All of this is just smoke and mirrors. With Israel, look at the facts on the ground. That's what matters. If there's any serious change in facts on the ground, then you could say progress is being made. But I just see a lot of talk, a lot of shuttle diplomacy, and nothing changing on the ground. Just getting worse, actually, for the native Palestinian population.
Yeah, I thought it was bizarre, is the most charitable way I could put it, that last week Trump is really trying to press that he wants a Nobel Peace Prize when he hasn't brought peace anywhere to any of these places. And it's just odd that's where his mind is, but none of his actions are there, because he could, if he wanted to, he could bring peace to these places by using our significant leverage in both the Russia, Ukraine, and in the Middle East. It could have ended those wars. And then I would advocate for him having a Nobel Peace Prize. But instead, he's facilitating the wars to continue on in both places. And that needs to be called out, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I'd be the first to vote for him for a Nobel Peace Prize if he could do that. But, I guess he thinks he just deserves it anyway. He starts the war in Iran, and then he sort of thinks he can broker a peace deal and get the Nobel Prize. It kind of shows you where Trump's head is at. And it's not in a place of reality, unfortunately.
It's not in a good place. It certainly doesn't help the people of Ukraine or the people of Gaza, which is, one of my primary concerns because of their powerlessness, and yet their suffering just continues on. But anyway, really appreciate you coming on today and at least giving us some clarity on this. Just also to let folks know that you have your Substack that you have there, in addition to the SundayWire.com. Anything that we need to know about that you're doing here lately?
No, I've launched a Substack. We're going to build a presence on there, so we just sort of got it rolling. So we'll be adding content there, so people can find out a little bit more about me and my work, and some different types of analysis on Substack, aside from the daily news and research and reports that we issue every day at 21stcenturywire.com.
Very good. Yeah. And we recommend people going there. And that was a really cool picture of you up there, by the way. So that was cool, because I know you've been around a little bit. You don't just stay in your little studio like I'm kind of stuck into it. So you have some mileage put on your shoes from stuff. So I recommend people go in there and check it out and find out what you're saying here lately. So thank you very much for coming on today, Patrick. We always appreciate it. We always also appreciate you guys, because without you, there is no show. And we are going to continue to be unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is and who's doing it, because you need to know the truth to make sense of the world around you. And we'll keep doing that. Thanks very much. And we'll see you on the next episode. Daniel Davis Deep Dive.